Do stupid people walk up to the mirror and look in that mirror and see a genius? You've probably asked questions like this and joked about it before, but one of the questions is there anything to this? Let's go back in history and see what great thinkers have thought about questions like this or not, to see if is this just a joke or is there something real. Let's go back to 400 BC, when Confucius pointed out that real knowledge is to know the extent of one's ignorance, pointing out the important fact that to have knowledge is to be able to know what you know and to know what you don't know. Plato, not long after, says, "I know nothing except the fact of my ignorance." He's not willing to accept what he knows because he knows too much about what he doesn't know to be able to do that, basically echoing what Confucius said. William Shakespeare, much later, says, "The fool doth think he is wise, but the wise man knows himself to be a fool," introducing a new concept that the fools think they're wise, but also the wise men think that they actually might be a fool. It's starting to look like there's something to this idea. George Bernard Shaw, "Beware of false knowledge. It is more dangerous than ignorance." In other words, thinking and being confident that you have knowledge when you actually don't is actually more dangerous. Bertrand Russell, "One of the painful things about our time is those who feel certainty are stupid, and those with any imagination and understanding are filled with doubt and indecision." Essentially saying that the incompetent people overestimate their abilities and the very competent people underestimate them. It's starting to look like something might be true here. And of course, we all know the expression, ignorance is bliss. So, let's imagine actually asking the question, is there anything to these claims? Are ignorant people actually ignorant of their ignorance? So, enter Dunning and Kruger. They actually decided to test this scientifically. And the way they did this is with 4 hypotheses. The first hypothesis is the obvious one. Incompetent people tend to overestimate their skill level. Simple thing to test, that's the hypothesis. Second, these incompetent people also fail to recognize the actual skill in others. So when other people are not competent or more competent, incompetent people can't tell the difference. 3, the incompetent people are also poor at seeing just how extreme their incompetence is. So if you have a really, really bad performer, they don't know they're a really, really bad performer. They actually think maybe they're a good performer. They can't really tell. And 4, and this is the important one, if they get additional training, they will actually admit that they were unskilled. Looking back, they will say, yeah, you're right. I was not as skilled as I thought I was. That's an important one because it tells you that if you can actually train people to actually improve, if you can break them out of this cycle. Okay, so here's the actual paper right here, published in 1999. All the details are there. You can go find it and read it and get all the gory details. Here's a summary. The studies were done with real people, so this is not hypothetical. This is actually science. This isn't just funny monkeys looking at Einstein in the mirror or quotes. This is actually tests that were done. They gave tests to subjects that were students. They gave different types of exams to them. And when they left the exam room, they were asked to assess their own abilities. They would basically be asked, how well do you think you did on that exam? And sure enough, what the data show quite clearly is that the poor performers overestimated their performance. In other words, this appears to be true. This is the Dunning-Kruger effect, that poor performers tend to overestimate their actual performance. And I'll show the data in a minute. Even when they were shown their scores, suppose their scores weren't very good, the more incompetent people judged themselves is having a higher relative rank to others than they actually did. So you have a poor performer, you show them their score is really bad, and you say, where do you think you rank relative to everybody else? They would typically say it was higher. So an example of this, of these two, is here, those in the 12th percentile, a very poor performance, placed themselves in the 60th percentile. They were at the very bottom and they put themselves above average. So it looks like, indeed, this is actually true. And that's why this phenomenon has actually a name, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Okay, so there's some good news in all of this. The good news is you watch this video, and now that you know that, you'll go out into the world and you will probably see examples of the Dunning-Kruger effect all around you. More importantly, hopefully you'll see it in yourself. All of us are subject to the Dunning-Kruger effect, and we almost always will be making mistakes and judging just how competent or skillful we actually are. And now we might be a little bit more aware of that and be able to judge ourselves better and then be able to perform better where we want to and where we need to. The other nice thing about the Dunning-Kruger effect is it's not like IQ, which is mainly genetic, but it actually addresses a top-down effect that's just how we see ourselves, how we assess ourselves, and how we are able to step back and look at what we're actually doing. In other words, it can be changed. It's not fixed in stone, and that's great, because now that you know this, you can go and deal with it in your own life.
Good morning. In a comment exchange I had with Skid Row Radio yesterday, I happened to mention in passing the Dunning-Kruger effect. And I've been thinking about it since, and I think it's quite an interesting phenomenon, really, which I just think is worth discussing a wee bit. So if you're not familiar with it, I'll just outline it a little bit, and then I'm just going to read something from a website I've been looking at about it. See what you think, really. The Dunning-Kruger effect is an effect in psychology. It was kind of written about in 1999 by Dunning and Kruger, in which they identified that it's to do with knowledge and learning and competence and self-assessment. That's the idea of it. And but the question being, how do people self-assess? How do people, when people evaluate their own performance at a particular task, a learning task, a knowledge-gathering task, how accurate are those self-assessments? And is there a relationship between a person's ability to self-assess and their actual knowledge? Yeah. And what they found with that is very interesting. What they found is that people who have a good grasp of a particular task, who have an actual real knowledge of a particular subject, tend to underestimate their possession of that knowledge. You know, people in the top echelons of any knowledge field, or any performance field, in fact, physical performances as well as mental performances. People who are at the top will tend to evaluate themselves lower. People at the bottom will tend to, on the other hand, will tend to evaluate themselves higher. So, people who are at the bottom end of the scale will say that they will have the impression and convey this impression that they're much more knowledgeable, much higher performers than they actually are. And that's very stable. It's been tested over and over again. It's very interesting. Okay, so let's just go through this. And he gives us, as I say, a series of points for aspects of Dunning-Kruger effect. The first one he says is skill, boundary, transgression. The individual is seeking to operate as an authority or qualified individual in a field beyond their personal level of academic and professional qualification. Now, there isn't just a kind of elitist claim for qualification. It's just about knowledge, really. He used the word qualification, but he could have said knowledge. So that's very common in Dunning-Kruger effects. People are operating well outside of their established, independently verified knowledge field. Secondly, self-identified authority. This is something else you get in people who are affected by the Dunning-Kruger effect. Self-identified authority. The individual identifies themselves as sufficiently competent to comment authoritatively on the subject. So even though no established authority, and I don't mean that in a divine sense, obviously, but no established authority is telling the person that they're competent, they will self-assess themselves as competent. And again, you see that quite a lot. Thirdly, unrecognised competence. Again, this is something claim an individual make, unrecognised competence. The individual's self-assessed competence is not recognised by those who are academically and professionally competent. So when those ideas that the person has are given scrutiny by people who are knowledgeable in a particular field, that they'll be dismissed, but it doesn't seem to affect the person's security in their beliefs in their own capacities. Fourthly, false peers, the presence of false peers. The individual believes that the favourable commentary of other unskilled and non-professional individuals indicates they themselves are sufficiently qualified. So when we don't know something very well, if we're unskilled, we tend to take the opinions of other unskilled people very seriously, in a way that we wouldn't if we were genuinely skilled. You know, if I genuinely was a motor mechanic, I would take the advice of people who were not skilled engineers and skilled motor mechanics. I would take it with a pinch of salt. But if I was an overconfident, unskilled motor mechanic, then I probably would take the recommendations of other unskilled motor mechanics as serious kind of commentary. And finally, allocentric claims of bias. The individual explains the difference between their views and those of qualified professionals as a result of inherent bias on the part of the professionals. Accusations of bias are directed at anyone other than themselves, and they claim objectivity. So that, again, that's very, very common for people who are prey to the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's a fascinating idea. It's obviously one that's important in education. It's one that's really, really difficult to shift because of its inherent qualities. You know, if you are unskilled, if you're lacking knowledge in a certain field, you don't recognise you're lacking knowledge, you don't recognise your own unskilled behaviours, and you reject any kinds of observation like the observation of Dunning-Kruger effect itself as allocentric bias or conspiracy effect. So it's very recalcitrant, it's very difficult to shift, but it is useful. I mean, I've certainly found this useful for myself because I feel myself being prey to it quite a lot. I often get strong feelings of certainty about things of which I know on a kind of objective level I am unskilled. You know, I don't have a degree in I've got a PhD, but it's just because it's a doctorate in philosophy doesn't mean to say know an awful lot about philosophy. I know an awful lot about a very specific field, but I don't know an awful lot about a lot of other things. But you can get that feeling of knowledge, can't you? You can get that feeling of certainty, and it manifests itself as a sense of obviousness, as a sense of certainty and truth, and so I do feel that in myself quite a lot, and I have to be careful with that. I'd not always succeed in being careful, but I do try to be careful and recognise that I might be just Dunning-Krugering. You know, I might just be Dunning-Krugering and ignoring other things.